However, I'm still a bit unclear as to how the vast differences in Lokis, such as Orc Loki and Alligator Loki, how are those on the same timeline? All right, well, thanks so much for the question. And yes, I did do a pretty in-depth breakdown of how the Marvel multiverse works over on Screen Crush a few weeks ago. I totally recommend going to check out that video, but I totally understand where your confusion is coming from because, I mean, let's face it, they overcomplicated it from the jump, and then all of us pundits overcomplicated it even more. But let me try to give like a super basic breakdown of how the MCU multiverse works and address those specific points that you brought up in your question. Such as Loki Gator being from the Sacred Timeline as well. So the rules of the MCU multiverse can feel super convoluted and confusing, but I want to try my absolute best to give you a super concise, bare bones explanation of how the multiverse works in the MCU, the differences between universes and timelines, how variant beings work, all that good stuff, and in the most straightforward way possible. So, in the MCU, there is a vast multiverse of variant universes existing alongside one another. In fact, they are stacked upon each other. Now, with these universes, time is just one of many ingredients that makes a universe a universe. Within one single universe, you can have multiple flows of time, meaning you can have multiple timelines. This was confirmed in What If Season 1 that you can indeed have multiple timelines within one single universe. Now, I know that already sounds a little confusing, so let me explain. Essentially, okay, imagine a scenario where I'm sitting here right now talking to you, and in one timeline, I keep sitting here and talking to you, and in another timeline, I stand up and I walk away. That in the MCU, that would create a splintered timeline, two different futures that share a common past, which was me sitting here on the stool before I made one of those decisions. Going into the whole Schrodinger box thing about how, before you open the box to find out if the cat's dead or alive, it essentially exists in two timelines. Not literally, but that's the metaphor that they use to try to explain the multiverse theory. So if you're watching this video, I assume you have probably seen Loki. So you're familiar with the idea of a branching timeline. Now, where people sometimes get confused, and me included, was does a splintered timeline therefore mean a new universe? No, not necessarily. There are variants, of that same being, like I just described. One timeline, I'm still sitting here talking. The other timeline, I got up and walked away. That means there are two timelines with me in them, and they share that same past. But they do not become two separate universes. They become two separate timelines within one universe. Now, why are they in the same universe and not creating entire other universes? Well, because those two timelines, if you trace them back, they share a Big Bang. They share a beginning. The Big Bang is the beginning of the universe itself and the creation of not only all of matter, but time itself. So that means that you can have multiple timelines, kind of consider them like alternate dimensions, existing parallel to one another within a single confined universe. So the sacred timeline, Universe 616, that we saw at the end of Loki season 1, that is one universe that He Who Remains, the King variant, he isolated their universe from the rest of the multiverse, which we saw at the end of Quantumania. He has a completely separate universe that has its own strands of time within that universe, timelines that run parallel to one another. Now, they obey a strict yet simultaneously vague storyline that can be vastly different when it comes to small little details, but it must hit certain key beats on the macro scale to keep from splintering off and going beyond this red line on the TVA screens that represent the barrier of that universe. So you can have a timeline in Universe 616 where Loki is born a girl instead of a boy, and that timeline can exist just fine in the sacred timeline and obey the storyline that He Who Remains put in place. The gender of Loki is irrelevant, but what is relevant is Loki having to be the villain that fails in order for heroes to rise. So Sylvie being a female Loki, that wasn't the problem. That wasn't what created the splintering timeline. And we already knew that because, she had been born and she was at age like what, 10 or 11. I'm not sure how old she was supposed to be in that scene specifically. I can't remember, but that's beside the point. She was born Loki and she lived her childhood as Loki, and that was perfectly fine within the sacred timeline. It didn't become a problem until she dreamed of becoming a Valkyrie, aka a hero. This is what created a splinter where she wouldn't go that villainous path that she, as a Loki, was destined to take. And that is what was unacceptable, and that is what made her a target of the TVA. And the same is true for Alligator Loki. If at some point in the early history of life on Earth there was a splintered timeline where alligators became the dominant species on the planet instead of humans, and the evolutionary chain was starkly different, you could have a scenario where that timeline follows the same general storyline to remain within the confines of the sacred timeline's like macro view of, staying in that order and not splintering off too far. And I mean, some people don't like to hear this, but if you go back far enough, your ancestors are fish. That's how evolution works. So if the evolutionary chain resulted in the being that we know as Loki, instead many, 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 many years later being born as an alligator, it can still work within the confines of that universe until that Gator Loki does something that breaks from the storyline, and that would be what got him sent to the void, not the fact that he is just an alligator. Him being an alligator wasn't a violation, that was perfectly fine. It was him violating the storyline that He Who Remains put in place, which it could, if it splintered beyond that barrier point, expose that universe to the wider multiverse and the other Kangs. So that is why Loki Gator was pruned. And guys, I'm not just like, pulling this out of my ass or anything. This is established in the Loki series with classic Loki. He avoided death at the hands of Thanos, even though that was what was written to happen. That has to happen. But he cast an illusion that Thanos then killed, or at least thought he killed, and he, classic Loki, disguised himself as a piece of floating debris out there in space. And he then went and he hid on a planet in exile, and the timeline continued as it was supposed to because Loki was assumed dead by everyone. Him actually surviving and sneaking off to live in solitude on that planet, it didn't create a spike or create a different flow of events that would detour from that predetermined path, because him living in solitude on that planet was exact and not like causing anything to ever happen. That was the exact same as if he had just died. But the second he left that planet and left that exile, it caused a massive spike and the TVA caught him.
But as soon as I took my first steps to getting off the planet, the TVA arrived. Because we, my friends, have but one part to play: the god of outcasts.
So with that being the case and multiple timelines being able to exist in one universe, then the question becomes, okay, well, if multiple timelines can exist within a single universe, then what are the other universes? What is the multiverse? Well, the multiverse is a collection of individual universes that all have their own origins, their own big bangs. Now, here's where it gets interesting. If each universe has different flows of time, this allows for timelines to branch too far and eventually go beyond the barrier of their universe and then collide with another universe, creating an incursion, the collision of two worlds. And when this happens too rampantly, the entire multiverse can collapse. Now, the Council of Kangs, who we saw in Quantumania, they seem to have worked out a multiverse that for the most part works. Each Kang represents their own universe that, are intermingling in this web of existence. But with that comes the natural part of, existence, which is death, the death of a universe. And that is why I think He Who Remains, the Kang variant who claims to have won the multiversal war, that's why he actually just separated himself entirely, separated his universe from this Council of Kangs and their multiverse, and he just does things on his own by himself. And really, I shouldn't even say that he left on his own. Really, as we saw in Quantumania, and I think He Who Remains is the later version of the Kang the Conqueror who we met in Quantumania. As we saw in that movie, the Council of Kangs are the ones who exiled Kang from their multiverse and trapped him in the quantum realm adjacent to his own home universe, Universe 616. So essentially, the sacred timeline that was run by He Who Remains, it was in hiding from the Council of Kangs that He Who Remains so greatly feared. And when Loki took the reins from He Who Remains and allowed their universe to now expand and the various timelines to go beyond the storyline that that He Who Remains had crafted, this now allows for the timelines to splinter and now be seen and accessed by the Council of Kangs. And that's why here we hear their leader, Immortus, say,
"They're beginning to touch the multiverse."
When they talk about the Exiled One being dead and the ones who killed him beginning to touch the multiverse, they are referring to Universe 616, the sacred timeline, beginning to rejoin the rest of the other universes that are overseen by the Council, and they are throwing a wrench into the multiverse that they likely worked really hard to keep flowing in peace with Kang now out of the picture. So you can think of the 616 now joining the multiverse as like taking a stick and swatting a spider web. You fuck the whole thing up. And I'd assume that that's what the plot of Avengers the Kang Dynasty was going to be. The Council of Kangs going to war with Loki in Universe 616. But now we're getting Avengers Doomsday, and I'm not sure how they're going to handle it. It would be pretty dope if we get to see or even hear mention of Doom, like taking out the entire Council of Kangs, and now he's coming for Loki and plans to reform the multiverse, but we'll just have to see. So thanks so much for the question. I hope that made sense, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts and theories down below. Hey everybody, Colton here, and this is the mailbag style show where I take your questions about Marvel, Star Wars, DC, movies and streaming in general, whatever you want to ask. Send it to the email address askcoltonnow@gmail.com, link in the description below, and maybe you'll see your question featured right here on the show.
You're still here. It's over. Go home.